Sarah.
Melissa.
What are we reading today?
True Biz by Sara Nović.
Excellent. Sarah, it is so great to see you once again after so recently having seen you and spent time physically together with our families in Boston, Massachusetts.
I know.
We spent the most glorious, almost 48 hours, jam-packed of family, friend fun together in the beautiful city of Boston. What an amazing time we had.
We really did. I feel like we could not have done more. We made the most of it. And it was truly like such a beautiful time, as was evident at my really intense waterworks when we said goodbye.
I know. I felt so bad about it. And even the kids were like, oh, poor Sarah. She really takes it so hard. And I was like feeling so much guilt. I'm like, Melissa, just shed a tear. So why do you have this ice cold heart? You're feeling the emotions. Show them.
We all display our emotions differently, Melissa. No judgment. But goodbyes are always like really sad for me because I love the people I love so much. And when it comes time to say farewell, I really take it hard. And waterworks aside, it was just such a great time. We had been kind of planning it. We knew it was coming because Tom, your husband, had a literary conference that he went to at the University of Maine in Orono.
Mm-hmm.
And you just thought, why not make this a family trip? Go to Boston, because even though you lived in the United States for a little while, you'd never really spent time in Boston, right?
No, I never had. Now, Tom had gone a couple of times, so some
that's
things were
right.
familiar to him.
Yeah.
So we were like full on tourists. Sometimes you don't want to just do the touristy thing. I get that. But I really enjoyed being a tourist in Boston, and I loved that city. Like everything was so close. I was shocked at how walkable everything was. And I felt like our trip was guided by some like key themes of like maybe some historical figures, some celebrity figures.
Robert McCloskey was like the number one, I feel like, overriding theme throughout our time together in Boston. And for those of you who don't know, which there's probably a lot of you because you were clueless about him, although I just couldn't stop talking about him.
You and others. It felt like it was pervasive amongst even just people tangential to our visit, which we could get into. But yeah, as background about the famous / infamous Robert McCloskey. Go ahead.
So Robert McCloskey was really primarily an artist and a children's author. And his most famous book was called Make Way for Ducklings. And it's all set in the public garden for the most part in Boston. And it's about a family of mallard ducks. And so I had gotten a hardcover copy of the book when William was born. I thought, wouldn't it be cute if I brought this book, I get a picture of the kids in one of the hotel beds, like all in their pajamas, and Violet, the oldest, is reading the book to the boys. And then I knew we were going to the public garden, which again is really prominently featured in this book. And there is a bronze statue of the mother duck and her ducklings walking into the public garden. And I thought, then we'll get a picture of them with the actual like bronze ducks. It's going to be great. It didn't work out. Everything was just so busy and frantic. It didn't happen. I'm someone that really tries to make fetch happen, and fetch doesn't always happen.
We didn't even see the ducks.
We didn't, but the kids did. And of course, I always think that I can telepathically like get people to do things that I want them to do. And so I was thinking, well, surely because I said, look for those ducks, because you and I had went off to look for a bookstore.
Classic.
And we left the husbands and the children together, and they were going to meet with us at this bookstore, Beacon Hill Books. So they were going to be walking out of the park. And I was like, look for the duck statue, thinking, and when you see it, take a picture with it of the children. But I didn't actually articulate that to anybody. And of course, I said to Violet, I see the duck statue. And she's like, oh, yes. I said, did you happen to take a picture? And she said, no. And I said, oh, okay. No problem. This is not happening. So as we were walking into the public garden, I just would not shut up about this book. I was like, oh, yes, this was in Make Way for Ducklings. Oh, this was also in Make Way for Ducklings. And everybody's just like, great, Sarah. So happy for you. And then one of the first books that we saw when we walked into the Beacon Hill Books was Make Way for Ducklings.
I think my favorite, though, of all of the Make Way for Ducklings connections was when we went to the Museum of Science. And not to say that science and literature are not intertwined in many ways, but there were not a lot of very overt references to books and or ducklings, quite frankly. But we were like with this interpreter talking about teeth.
Animal teeth with actual animal skulls with the kids.
And at one point he says, oh, you know what? I had one of my favorite books as a child. Are you by any chance familiar with Robert McCloskey?
And I was like, why, yes, I am. And his book, Blueberries for Sal, which features a bear. He was talking about how bears eat both meat and vegetation.
As evidence
eating
by
blueberries. Yeah. And I was like, see, I'm not the only one.
Actually, when we got to New Brunswick, I don't think I've told you this yet. When we got to New Brunswick, my mother-in-law said, did you enjoy your time in the public gardens? And I was like, oh, yeah, of course. And she's like, did you see the little bronze ducklings? I was like, touchy subject. We did not. We sort of did.
Heard about him. Definitely heard about him. We have read that book many times, as well as a few of his other books.
It's almost kind of funny that given how strong a presence Robert McCloskey was and all the things we did manage to jam pack into this tour of Boston, this whirlwind visit, that we didn't see those of all things, but we did have like such a beautiful time in the public gardens, not only on the swan boats, but there was a gorgeous, I don't know if it was a quintet. I can't quite remember. I think it was mostly saxophone players.
Yeah, the sax stands out for sure.
Oh man, they were so good. Right when we walked in, it was almost like they were playing our soundtrack because they were playing Taylor Swift, Blank Space.
Yeah,
And
was
of course,
Violet was
she was rocking out.
What a great introduction to the public garden for her. And that was another theme. Taylor Swift did come up several times because we were talking about her new album. I was asking Violet what she thought about the new album. And then I ended up launching into like a whole story. I think there is like a bit of a theme here of me like lecturing about different things. But Taylor Swift has a home, a summer home or a beach house in Rhode Island, which is very close to where we live here in Connecticut. And it happens to be the same town that my mother-in-law lives in, Westerly, Rhode Island. And I was telling you and Violet at dinner in the North End of Boston all about the last great American dynasty and how that song from Folklore is about that house and the history of that house. And you and Violet were such good listeners and really humored my lectures.
Call them lectures. We love your information sharing. As a Atlantic Canadian gal, grew up in Nova Scotia, my roots in Newfoundland. I spent a lot of time driving through or hanging out in Cape Breton, and we would always see signage there for Alexander Graham Bell's summer house. And that was sort of like a destination, like a tourist site to go check out, where he allegedly spent a great deal of time trying to or working towards the invention of the telephone. I was surprised to know that he actually lived in Boston. Now, there's lots of connections between Cape Breton and Boston. We often hear people talk about their Boston cousins or people moving to the Boston states, various diasporas from Atlantic Canada, particularly Cape Breton. But I did not realize that Alexander Graham Bell was primarily a resident of Boston. And spoiler alert, he's about to come up in this podcast. Do you want to explain why, Sarah?
I was telling you about a book that I had read and that I had been thinking about might be my next pick for the podcast. The book is called True Biz by Sara Nović, and it's about deaf history and deaf culture. And randomly, I mentioned Alexander Graham Bell. And I was like, he is featured, or at least a story about him is featured in the book, and how he was someone who is not looked upon with fondness from the deaf community because he was interested in eugenics and maybe the idea of eradicating deafness in the human population. And he was interested in this despite, or maybe because of the fact that he had a deaf wife. I think he had a deaf mother. And I was telling you about this, like, yeah, I never knew this about Alexander Graham Bell. You always hear about him, oh, inventor of the telephone. But then, this book shined like a slightly different light on him. And so we were chatting about this and other elements of the book. And then the next day, we're sitting on this duck boat tour. And as we're driving through Boston, via Pierre,
our host and driver,
he starts talking about Alexander Graham Bell and how he was not only the inventor of the telephone, but that he was the inventor of the telephone because he was doing experiments to try to help those who were deaf or hearing impaired. And you and I are sitting on this duck boat tour going like, interesting. Okay.
wow, this is a very strange circle of events. So this book was not one I was aware of. It's gotten a lot of attention. It was on Reese's book club, that sort of thing. And once I did start looking it up when you suggested it, it seems like it's been quite popular in the last, 2 or 3 years. But how did it end up in your hands?
This is terrible, but I was shopping for some things on Amazon, and we don't have Amazon Prime right now. And so in order to get the free shipping, I was like, I had to add on a certain amount of money, like $12 or something like that. And so I was like, okay, well, I should get a book. And then some of the books that I really had wanted to get were new. And so they were a little bit more expensive. And so I was like, I don't really want to spend like $29 on a book right now. So I'm looking.
I do love that you said $29. So like $29.99 plus tax to eliminate shipping and handling.
So I'm looking through different books on Amazon, and then the cover of this one is quite colorful, and it has a hand doing a sign. I wonder, I want to know more about this. So I read the blurb and the fact that it was about deaf culture. And I, through marriage, have family that are members of the deaf community. My husband's aunt and uncle are both deaf. And I just thought, I think I'm going to add this on because maybe it'll give me a little bit more information and knowledge. And I was really interested in reading a book, a fiction about the deaf community, like what that story would look like and what it would feel like. And it was focused more on like youth culture too. So I thought, oh, this will be cool. I'm always trying to be down with the youth. And so that's how I ended up getting that through good old Amazon.
Good old Amazon, delivering what we need and what we don't need
Mm-hmm.
all of the time. I do like the cover of this one as well. I'm such a sucker for that kind of thing. But I was also really intrigued by the title. And I'm wondering if you can explain the title, but it's kind of a two-part request because I'm assuming that a bit of a summary would help out at this stage in the conversation.
I think I can do both. I'm going to certainly try. So the title of the book is True Biz. And I was very curious about that too, and what that meant. And so True Biz is essentially like a deaf kind of slang word for kind of real talk. There is a sign. And in fact, the sign that is on the cover of the book is the sign for True Biz. The book itself is set at the River Valley School for the Deaf, which is a fictional deaf school set in Colson, Ohio, which is in Southern Ohio. It focuses on about 6 months of the school year at this school for the deaf. And it primarily focuses on 3 characters. I would say the primary character is Charlie Serrano, who is new to the school. She's coming into the school as a sophomore or grade 10 student. Prior to that, she was in a public school system. She has a cochlear implant. She never learned sign language and had really primarily focused on reading lips because despite her having this cochlear implant, her hearing was still impaired enough where it made communication very hard for her. And so she had struggled all through her kind of school experience and is now finally going to the school for the deaf to be immersed in an environment with all deaf people so that she can really learn sign language. And so she's one piece of this 3-person puzzle, but I would say she is the primary character. We also follow February Waters, who is the headmistress of River Valley School for the Deaf. She is a hearing person, but she was born to deaf parents. So she grew up in an environment, really a deaf culture and deaf family environment where she is fluent in sign language. And she really understands the 2 different worlds between those of hearing people and those of deaf people. And so we kind of follow her. She's in an administrative position. And so she's always really trying to walk the line and understand and advocate for her students and also navigate her way through a world that doesn't really understand deaf culture. And then finally, our third character is Austin Workman. He is kind of like the golden boy in this school. He is I believe, a third generation deaf person. And so he's really grown up in this rich environment where he's been nurtured, he's been surrounded by deaf people, and he really is thriving. He is just a good kid, very conscientious, loves his family, loves his school, loves his friends. And he is someone that February connects with Charlie, kind of like a little mentor for Charlie as she's navigating this new environment. And so the plot kind of goes from there. I would say it's a very political book because Sara Nović herself, she is an advocate for the deaf community. She works at a school for the deaf. So she has some strong opinions, and they definitely find their way into this book. And I would say that this book is really a historical, cultural lesson that's been disguised as a novel. And I think it's a clever way to teach people about a culture that I think a lot of us don't have exposure to unless you have friends or family or in a community with a lot of deaf people. It can be a spot where people just aren't informed about. And so I felt like I learned a lot from this book.
What would you say is the top lesson or the top piece of information you took from this?
Well, for one, I was not aware of the controversy around cochlear implants. From a hearing perspective, we think, what a beautiful thing. I don't know if you've seen, there's a video that was viral, and it's of a baby that has gotten a cochlear implant, and she hears her mother's voice for the first
I
time.
remember that.
And it's, like a bit of a tearjerker because like this baby's expression keeps going back and forth between like joy and like kind of sadness. And so you think about that and you think like, what a gift we're giving a child, this cochlear implant. But I think that among the deaf community, that's not necessarily a sentiment that's shared. Even in the very beginning of the book, there's a few different quotes. The first one is from Aristotle. Again, going back to Taylor Swift. She has a quote about Aristotle in her newest record that just makes me wince. But anyway, but this particular one says, those who are born deaf all become senseless and incapable of reason. That's from Aristotle. 384 to 322 BCE. Second one is from Alexander Graham Bell. Those who believe as I do that the production of a defective race of human beings would be a great calamity to the world will examine carefully the causes that lead to the intermarriages of the deaf with the object of applying a remedy. So that's Alexander Graham Bell. There you go.
And again, he was married to a woman who was deaf?
And his mother was deaf. I'm like 99% sure. Yeah. And then the third is from NBC News from March 14th, 2014. A manufacturer of amazing medical devices known as cochlear implants, which restore hearing to the deaf, sold defective implants to young children and adults for years, even after learning that a significant number of the devices had failed. So this is before you even start reading the book. These are the three things that she wants you to think about as you're going into this book.
And I love that the span of time covered there from Aristotle. Alexander Graham Bell would have been 1800s, maybe mid to late 1800s.
He was like late 1800s, early 1900s.
And then you've got 2014. Like, I've got shoes as old as that. And yeah, such a consistency in terms of disrespect to a group of people. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So that's where we're starting off from. Charlie, I feel like she's the heart of the book because you're really going on a journey with her. When you think about character development, which is, again, something that we talk about, like you see so much growth within her because she's a bit troubled, right? And she's never really fit in and doesn't have a great relationship with her parents, in particular her mother. The only reason why she's going to this school for the deaf is because her parents have just divorced, and as part of the divorce agreement, her father was really advocating for her to go to a school for the deaf, and her mother wanted nothing to do with it. It was her mother who had really been the person pushing for this cochlear implant when she was a very young child, and who wanted her to be assimilated into the world of the hearing and didn't want her to use sign language. And in fact, the doctors who had given her this cochlear implant had said, do not teach her sign language because she'll rely on it as a crutch. You need to put her into a regular school. Obviously there'll be some therapies that she'll go through in order to like adjust to having this cochlear implant, because, you know, she's gone from being in a silent environment to now one that's full of sound and trying to make sense of those sounds. But she needs to learn how to rely on her ears and not rely on her ability to sign. And so do not introduce sign to her. And so this is someone who's been deprived of that. And that's really what the book is arguing, that it is a deprivation. So she's coming in like really behind. And so as part of this divorce agreement, she's now finally being exposed to American Sign Language for the first time in her whole life. She's 15 years old at this point. So I do have like a quote that I wanted to share. This is like one of the early Charlie chapters, because each character kind of gets their chapters. They go back and forth throughout the book. It might be a little bit of a long quote and we can figure out where we want to go. But Charlie remembered the earliest years of her education with a certain fondness. Less unsupervised time and therefore less bullying, snack breaks, and coloring and scissor skills she could ace alongside her peers. But the language acquisition the doctors had promised post-implant had been slow to materialize. For a while, she made progress in a little white room where she sat at a table across from a well-intentioned blonde lady who dealt largely in spit. Charlie had spent hours with that woman learning about mouth shapes and airflow by blowing out candles or holding her nose or pressing an upside-down spoon on her tongue. But outside the confines of that therapist's office, so many sounds were still inscrutable. Her classrooms were noisy, and she couldn't find the words they'd practiced out there amid the din. It started to show. The students began learning to read, spell, even add via call and response, a mire of sounds through which Charlie waded with trepidation. Her teachers scolded her when she was slow or off task, raised concerns at parent conferences about whether she had additional disabilities. Charlie did not know how to explain that she couldn't possibly find the answers when she didn't know the questions. She began prone to what her mother called spells. Her teachers called them behaviors, as if any action from a child beyond total compliance was implicitly bad. Charlie, of course, called them nothing at all, which was part of the problem. She didn't remember much about the outburst now, just flashes. Her teacher trying to peel her from the tile floor while Charlie thrashed in her grip, the heat of her tears and phlegm mid-tantrum, and most of all, that burning feeling that ran from her forehead straight to the pit of her stomach when the word you need is on the tip of your tongue, but you can't quite wrangle it. Except for Charlie, it was all the words. And this was how she'd come to do a stint in special ed. So again, long quote, but I think that really gives you a picture of what this experience of hers was like. I thought this was interesting because a few chapters later, we get an Austin chapter. And again, he's the golden boy. He's the one that's been raised in a deaf community his whole life, never really experienced anything what Charlie experienced.
But before we get into Austin too, like,
Yeah.
just that whole passage to me, we have this desperate need to be able to categorize people. And it's so much more than that. Like the line that really stood out to me in that passage that you read was they wanted to know if she had, and I'm quoting here, like additional disabilities, right? We need more diagnoses. And then how much language is such a big part of that. It's the barrier. She has no conduit by which to communicate, and it's getting in the way of any kind of productive conversation or communication with people, and just how isolating and defeating that would feel. Not to mention a kid who's already just trying to figure out how to navigate their world anyway. And then now you've got this Austin character on the other end of the situation. So he obviously had a very different experience kind of trying to handle his deafness.
She's looking at it as a handicap, and because she's surrounded by people who are telling her that, whereas he's not looking at that from that angle at all. He's just a person living in the world, able to communicate with the people around him. And communication is so crucial to being a person. We are social creatures. We need to be able to communicate with people. And so what astounded me throughout this whole book is this idea of depriving people of communication because you're favoring one form of communication over another. But there are other ways of communicating. In one of the February chapters, because she has a meeting with Charlie and her parents, and she's feeling a little bit nervous because Charlie's quite old to be just coming into a school like this for the first time and having to learn ASL. And she can see that Charlie's a very bright, intelligent young woman, but she knows that there's been so many hurdles that she's had to get over. And she's hoping that she can kind of keep up and find a place. And she talks about, how there is a window of time. And if a child is deprived of communication skills in that early childhood window, that sometimes it becomes forever closed. And it does create some deficits that people are unable to overcome, which I found, kind of interesting. But the idea that there are people out there and have historically since, sign language has been used with this idea that you can't do both, that you can't learn to read lips or to have a cochlear implant and use that, but then also sign. I mean, I think about your kids and kids of a lot of my friends and family members who live in Canada. Like, your kids are bilingual. They're going to school in French. They're in a French immersion program. They learn English at home. They speak English at home and out in their community, but they also speak French in their community. And we look at that as like a great thing. We're equipping them with multiple languages. Yet there's been this idea among the hearing community that if a child is hearing impaired and you give them sign language, that they'll use it as a quote unquote crutch. But we would never look at that as like, well, no, a child can't learn French and you're also teaching them English, then they're going to use one as a crutch. No, we look at them as like we're opening up a world to them. And that is really what this book is saying too. Like, why wouldn't we want people to have their worlds open up? Like, why is ASL not something that like we are learning commonly in school so that we can be inclusive of people? Austin, as someone who's been at this school for the deaf since he was a child and grew up in a deaf environment, he's seen kids like Charlie, but at younger ages. And he's seen them come in from, regular public schools and the feelings that he gets from like watching this happen. And he says, most of Austin's peers had learned to sign here at school. For them, River Valley was synonymous with safety, a place where they could understand and be understood. But he knew the consequences of living without a safe harbor, had heard all the stories of completely out of control kids who'd come in from mainstream school. A few years ago, a fourth grader had slapped his teacher during a math test. And last year, a middle schooler had set fire to the dorm carpet. The tantrums he'd seen up close had always been more mournful than violent, though. The clearest memory was of a morning in second grade when a boy had stood in the center of the classroom, howling, inconsolable for nearly an hour. The rest of them had been instructed to choose a game and to take it to the circle time rug, while the teacher and her aide tried to sort out what was wrong. Austin watched churning Play-Doh through a press while his classmate wailed and pointed at his stomach. The teachers removed and checked the boy's implant, then gave him an early snack of animal crackers and apple juice, which he promptly vomited in a pinkish puddle on the floor. Splashback on the teacher's pants. The aide took him to the nurse. At the time, Austin was incredulous that the parents could have forgotten to teach their child basic signs about feeling sick, ones he was sure he had always known. It wasn't until later that he learned that ASL had likely been withheld intentionally in an attempt to motivate speech. So,
because I know there was a movement even when our kids were babies to teach them to sign first.
I know. Totally, with William as well, like more and all done and
hungry.
And they learn those, they pick those up so quickly. Before they even actually have speech, they have the ability to sign. It's amazing that there is such a controversy of what you introduce first and can you introduce them at the same time. And again, within like this whole idea of like cochlear implants and like if you have a cochlear implant, then you should really like focus on speech and hearing. You should not be focused on signing.
Is cochlear implants like its own modernized version of eugenics in the sense of like, we'll just eradicate it by replacing it with technology, right? So we're not going to kill people off. We've come far enough to know that that's not the right approach. We'll just replace it with a technology is kind of its own way of just eradicating it or erasing it. Mm-hmm. But I'm also really drawn just from like a literary standpoint or a creative standpoint, what a rife world to tap into. And I feel so guilty that I've never really considered it. And that this whole world is amazing for inciting this level of conversation with people to be like, no, you have to think about it from this perspective. You have to think about tools that we have. But the fact that she also said it within these three characters primarily, and in a school and with teenagers, just all of these different situations and circumstances coming together, what a really amazing place or world or setting or circumstance in which to set this story. Because there's so many different directions it can take and so many contact points for readers too, to be like, oh yeah, I can relate to this part, can't relate to this part. Yeah, such a really effective book. book?
There's a few things that she does that I appreciated, and I thought it was creative. Pretty much every chapter, it's the history lesson or the lesson
Oh.
in language and use of ASL that Charlie is learning about. So you're learning it alongside with Charlie. And there's
Mm.
so many things that I found it so informative. And I thought, what a creative way. And there's a lot of illustrations on different hand formations to make signs and what they mean and the context, like really like what this language looks like. And I thought that was so clever.
How does she deal with dialogue?
So when someone is using sign language, it's all italicized and indented. I thought it was pretty clear. Charlie goes back and forth from using speech to signing. And it's cool to see her doing more signing as the book goes on because
Ah.
her and her father are going to a class together to learn ASL together. So she's learning ASL like in the evenings alongside her father. And then during the day, she's going to the school and she's living at the school and going to regular classes, like going to math classes and history classes. And
Could you detect a difference in Charlie's tone or ability to express herself in the sections or in the passages where she was using sign language as compared to when she was speaking orally?
yeah, it's interesting because there's several areas where she's speaking with people and she is reading their lips and trying to hear them using her cochlear implant. But again, everything is so garbled and she constantly has a buzzing in her ear because ultimately she has one of the faulty cochlear implants. The cochlear implant is kind of useless to her, but she can hear some things, but she mostly relies on reading lips. But you'll see somebody saying something to her, but there'll be a blank because she'll miss a word.
Oh.
And so she'll have to ask them to repeat themselves. But then as well as she's learning sign language, and she always talks about their hands like rapidly flying. And she loves watching people and she gets more and more fascinated and she can start picking things up more and more as time is going on, as the semester is going on. But she at the same time has a hard time with understanding symbols because one of the things that she struggled with when she was initially in this class with her father was this idea of this absence of the verb to be, like
Mm.
in ASL. And she didn't quite understand. She's like, what? I can't understand. Like, what is it just non-existent in ASL? Like, what does this mean? And so she's part of a play. They're putting on like a play of, I think it's Peter Pan in the book. And she's like in the background crew, like, setting lights and stuff. And then of course, Austin is like, I think Peter Pan himself, like, of course he would be Golden Boy. But she starts making friends with people as part of the production. And so they're all, I think, in the lunchroom eating. The book says, after a while, she even got up the nerve and the receptive skills to ask her lunchmates about the verb to be. What that? She signed, pointing to one boy's lunch tray. Pizza, someone said. What is that? She said. She finger spelled emphatically, question marked her eyebrows. Austin understood first. With a flash of recognition, he scrunched up his face and gave her a scolding finger wag. Finger wag, he said. Like, don't use that. Like, that's not proper. Charlie was disappointed. So is and am and are just weren't? How could a language exist without so fundamental a concept? Perhaps, she thought grudgingly, her mother and doctors were right about the limitations of signing. Could you have a real language without the notion of being? But Austin just pointed to Charlie's hand, then made his own gesture, sweeping up from his stomach out into an arc across the room. Charlie copied the sign, but that didn't seem to be what he wanted. She stared. Me, said Austin, pointing to himself. He patted his chest, then his arms, then held out his hands, flexed his fingers before her. You, he said. He took her by the wrists and held her own hands out before her. She looked down at her palms and understood. Her being was implied, her potential thoughts and feelings coursing through her body, the names of everything she knew and those she didn't yet, all in perpetual existence in her fingertips. And I just thought that was so lovely. She finally gets it.
And I feel like that idea of her ability to be
Mm.
her right to be being implied also illustrates a sense of belonging, right? That
Yes.
she's also now found a place where she can be, and a language in which she can be a version of herself that has been denied up to that point. As you know, my professional life has a lot to do with language
Yeah.
learning. And so this has really put my head in that space as well, especially given that there's kind of like a bit of a joke in the language learning world when it comes to English anyway. It's like, if you don't know where to start with the verb to be. It is so fundamental, right? It's like, I am is
Mhm.
where you can begin. But I'm so interested also in now this interplay between language and culture, which we talk about so much in terms of English in my professional world, and now seeing it play out in another language and another cultural kind of context that sort of lives and exists within the one that I also live and exist in is really fascinating. You mentioned earlier in the conversation that she was later learning ASL and that they were very upfront with her that this could present additional challenges because she hadn't learned it early on. And I couldn't help but think about, accents. How does that play out in an ASL world? People have voice when we speak. I'm sure people have voice when they speak with ASL. When you mentioned about slang, like I'd never heard True Biz because that's a piece of slang that exists within a language that I don't know.
So there was a really interesting kind of part of the book where Charlie is out with all of her friends through this play, and it includes her roommate. Her roommate is named Kayla, and Kayla is Black. And they're all out, they're getting pizza together, and they're talking about what kind of pizza they're going to get. Austin asks Kayla, what kind of pizza are you going to get? She says barbecue chicken, and she does a certain sign for chicken. And so Charlie tried to copy the sign. And then Austin held up a hand and he stopped her and he said, "No, don't sign like that. Sign like this." Austin says to Kayla, he said, "Your sign looks like a diaper. That's not chicken." And then Kayla gets pissed off and she's like, "It is chicken. You're being racist. This is Black
Oh.
sign language." Just like in the public school education system, there was segregation within the sign language community. And so Black Americans have their own sign language. So there are
Whoa.
cultural differences within sign language in the United States.
There's dialect.
There is dialect. One of the history lessons also is that Martha's Vineyard, which is a small island off the coast of Massachusetts, back in the 1850s, there was like almost like a little utopia happening in Martha's Vineyard. Martha's Vineyard's deaf population peaked in the 1850s. At the time, one in approximately 5,700 Americans was deaf. But in the Vineyard, it was 1 in 155. And then in the town of Chilmark, it was 1 in 25. Deaf islanders developed their own sign language, Chilmark Sign, now called Martha's Vineyard Sign Language, MVSL. Deaf and hearing islanders all signed. And Alexander Graham Bell did go and kind of observe and study the people living, because that was around the time that he would have been doing his experiments.
Okay, we have brought this full circle. We're back to Alexander Graham Bell. I think this is like the universe sending us a signal of sorts. I just am so fascinated by how rife this story is. I feel like we could talk about this one
we really could,
a lot longer, but I am going to call the question in this moment and ask you, is True Biz by Sara Nović a could read, a should read, or a must read?
It is a solid should read. Now, that might be surprising. I know you have a surprise look on your face because you would think I would say must read, and I am more prone to say must reads about things. I think it's a should read because it is so packed with information, and you will learn from reading this book, which is important. It's an easy and very digestible way to learn about deaf history and deaf culture, and that makes it worth the read. Mm-hmm. And you do care about the characters and you do see character development and growth. But the way that it's written, some of the storylines are just full of plot holes. And like, there are things that I think don't need to be in the book. There are characters that I find are really, it's like tokenism. Like even Kayla, I think that was an important thing to learn. But like, we don't really know Kayla very much. She pops in and out like in conversation with Charlie, but like, that's not fleshed out. Although it's important to know about, like, she just in there so that we know about Black Sign Language. Even like the way that Charlie's mother is characterized, like she's so one-dimensional. Like in being so afraid of ASL and not in favor of Charlie learning it. And she's kind of like a caricature of like an evil stepmother, but in fact, it's like her birth mother. And there's like a whole other plot that I did not even get into that has to do with someone that Charlie knows from the hearing community who's like kind of like a ex-fling, current fling. And he's like a bit of an anarchist. And like,
Oh my goodness.
there's like, and then there's a whole, like the book opens with like kind of like a teaser where it's a flash forward and like Austin and Austin's roommate have gone missing, and like February is trying to like do damage control, and she goes on the news to talk about it, and then she finds out that Charlie's missing too, and then it goes 6 months before, and that's when we get into the bulk of the narrative. That storyline, which begins the book, does not pay off. So it does not need to be in there. That could have not been in there at all, and it would have been a better book for it. And that's why it's a should read and not a must read, because it could be a could read if not for all of the important, interesting information that's in the book.
Well, I have to confess, surprised, because the whole conversation, I was like, I'm already ready to call this a must read. I've never read the book. Turns out reading the book is what takes it down a notch.
Yeah. I think if you have any interest, which I think you should have interest in learning about people from different cultures, I think as human beings, first seek to understand. It made me, I actually had like so much guilt reading this book and thinking about like my own family members who I've been in her life. She's been in my life for like over a decade, and I don't know her very well. And even just talking to Josh's mom, that's her sister, and learning about her childhood and like her experience with education, it really opened up the world and made me look at her differently and made me think like I should learn sign language. For that reason, it's a should. If you're looking at it because you want like a really well-written piece of fiction, they're not necessarily going to get, you're going to be frustrated by some of the plot holes, but I do think it's a should read. So there you go.
Beautiful. Sara, it is so great to be back in your midst, albeit through a screen this time. But I do feel like because we've so recently been together physically, that we're still kind of holding on to that physical connection today. And it was beautiful. I wish you a beautiful day. It is early on Saturday morning, for those of you wondering whether we're drinking old fashions or not this time. Nope, it's coffee and green tea. All right. Love you. Bye for now.
Love you too. Bye.